9/11, what's your emergency? He stabbed my son. Please hurry. You already know this is going to be bad. But trust me, it's worse than you think. It started with a knock at the door. It ended with a 6-year-old lying in a pool of his own blood. His name was Wadea Al-Fayoume. He had big dreams, a bright smile, and a mother who would have done anything to protect him. His killer? A man they trusted. A man who let them into his home, only to turn it into their tomb. Joseph Czuba. A 71-year-old landlord with no criminal record. No history of violence. Until one day something inside him snapped. What made him grab a knife and stab a child 26 times? Fear? Or something even worse? Let's talk about fear for a second. Fear makes people do strange things. It makes them lock their doors, cross the street, whisper under their breath when someone different walks by. But sometimes, fear mutates. It festers. Until one day it picks up a knife. On October 14, 2023, fear walked into Wadea Al-Fayoume's home and didn't leave until he took his last breath. And the reason? A war happening over 6,000 miles away. The jury took less than 90 minutes to decide his fate. But for Wadea's family, the verdict came too late. Because no sentence, no punishment, can bring back a child. But before we get there, we need to go back. Back to the morning it all happened. Back to the moment a knock on the door became a death sentence. Because to understand this crime, we have to step inside the mind of a man who thought a 6-year-old was his enemy. It started with a knock. Not a loud, urgent knock. Not the kind that makes your heart jump. No, this one was slow. Measured. A sound so ordinary it barely registered as a threat. Inside that house, a 6-year-old boy was playing. His mother, Hanaan Shahin, was doing what mothers do, taking care of her child, managing a life that was finally starting to feel normal. And outside that door? A man she had known. A man she had spoken to. A man who, just months before, had agreed to let them live in his home. Joseph Czuba. If monsters were easy to spot, life would be a whole lot safer. They'd come with flashing red lights. Warning signs stapled to their foreheads. Maybe even a little background music, something slow and menacing to give us a heads up before they struck. But Joseph Czuba? He wasn't that kind of monster. He was, by all accounts, unremarkable. A 71-year-old landlord. A husband. A man who had lived in Plainfield, Illinois, for decades without causing much of a stir. His record was clean. His life was quiet. Almost forgettable. Then one morning he picked up a knife. Before he became a killer, Joseph Czuba was just another face in the neighborhood. The kind of man you'd pass at the grocery store without a second glance. He wasn't known for violent outbursts. He wasn't on any watch list. He wasn't the type to make headlines. Until he did. But here's the thing about people like Czuba, monsters that blend in. You don't see them coming until it's too late. He had been a landlord for years. Owned property. Rented out rooms. Nothing particularly unusual. But those who knew him said he had a certain edge. Not the kind that gets you arrested. Not the kind that screams danger. But the kind that makes you wonder just for a second if something isn't quite right. Neighbors described him as quiet, withdrawn. The type who didn't go out of his way to make friends. Some called him paranoid. Others said he was just old school. But after October 14, 2023, people started asking different questions. Had anyone seen this coming? Were there signs? Warnings? Red flags? Because what he did that morning wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a moment of lost control. It was planned, deliberate, calculated. And when he knocked on that door, he already knew what he was going to do. Wadea Al-Fayoume was 6 years old. 6. At that age, the biggest problems in the world should be deciding which cartoon to watch or whether bedtime is really necessary. Wadea was a kid who loved soccer, played with his toys, and smiled at just about everyone. He had big brown eyes full of wonder. The kind of kid who made the world a little lighter just by being in it. But for Joseph Czuba, Wadea wasn't a child. He was a symbol. A target. An enemy in a war the boy didn't even know existed. A mother who fled violence, only to find it again. Hanaan Shahin had seen violence before. She had lived through it, escaped it, fled to America to build a life where her son could be safe. She believed in the idea that this country could be a refuge. A place where a mother and child could live without fear. Then came the morning that shattered that belief. That morning when she opened the door expecting a landlord, but finding a killer instead. The final warning signs. Here's the part that makes your stomach turn. Because this wasn't random. Days before the attack, Czuba had been spiraling, talking about the news, the war in Gaza, the fear that they were coming. He told his wife he believed Muslims were dangerous, that they were a threat, and that he was afraid of, lived under his own roof. Hanaan Shahin, Wadea Al-Fayoume, a mother and her child. And in his mind that was enough. When she heard that knock, she didn't know it would be the last time she'd see her son alive. But Joseph Czuba did. The door opened. The nightmare began. And the next chapter is where things turn bloody. Fear spreads fast. It doesn't knock. It doesn't ask permission. It seeps into conversations, slithers into news reports, lingers in the glances exchanged between strangers. And by October 7, 2023, it was everywhere. Half a world away, war had erupted in Gaza. Half a world away, bombs were dropping, buildings were collapsing, families were running for their lives. But fear? Fear doesn't obey geography. Fear doesn't need a passport to travel. And in a quiet Illinois town, inside a house where nothing had ever really happened before, Joseph Czuba was watching. Listening. Absorbing every headline, every talking point, every whispered rumor about a war that had nothing to do with him. Until it did. October 7, 2023, the war that fueled the fire. When the first reports broke out of Gaza, the world held its breath. War wasn't new to that region, but this time it felt different. Explosions lit up the night sky. Air raid sirens screamed. Children hid in basements, in bathrooms, in their mothers' arms. It was chaos, destruction, suffering, broadcasted in real time to millions of homes across the world. And in the United States? The ripples hit hard. Protests erupted overnight. Some waved Palestinian flags. Others waved Israeli flags. Streets filled with people shouting, demanding justice, demanding answers. Social media turned into a battlefield. Opinions were fired like bullets. Every post, every comment, every argument felt like another spark tossed into a pile of gasoline. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Joseph Czuba sat in his living room watching. And the more he watched, the more he listened, the more convinced he became of something dangerous. The war wasn't just over there. It was here. Joseph Czuba wasn't a man of action. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a politician. He was a 71-year-old landlord with a limp and a quiet reputation. But fear doesn't care who you are. Fear plants itself in your mind, spreads like a disease, twists logic until even the most absurd ideas start to feel real. And in the days after October 7th, something inside him changed. He started watching the news obsessively. Every channel. Every update. He muttered under his breath when he thought no one was listening. His wife noticed. His neighbors noticed. But no one thought much of it. Because it's just words, right? Just thoughts. Until they aren't. Muslims are dangerous. 4 words. A belief. A conclusion drawn from fear, from ignorance, from the endless loop of violence playing on his screen. And once that thought settled in, it never left. People who knew him said he started acting different. More withdrawn. More tense. If someone tried to talk to him about the war, he'd shut down or change the subject. His wife later said that he was convinced Muslims were dangerous. That he was afraid they were planning something. That he didn't feel safe in his own home anymore. Safe from what? A 6-year-old boy? A mother who had fled war just to build a better life? But fear doesn't need facts. Fear feeds on imagination, on worst-case scenarios, on late-night news reports that blur the line between reality and fiction. And Joseph Czuba? He was drowning in it. The night before the attack, something shifted. Czuba barely spoke to his wife. He ate in silence. Stared at the walls. Checked the locks on the doors 3 times before going to bed. And in the middle of the night, when his wife woke up, she found him sitting in the living room. Awake. So. Just staring. At what? At nothing. Or maybe at everything. The morning of October 14, 2023. The final moment of peace. The house was quiet that morning. Hanaan Shahin made breakfast. Wadea played, probably with his toy cars or his favorite soccer ball. It was just another Saturday morning. Ordinary. Peaceful. And outside, Joseph Czuba stood in his own home, staring at the door that separated him from them. Did he hesitate? Did he second-guess himself? Or had he already made up his mind? At some point he picked up a knife. A military-style blade. 12 inches long. At some point, he made his way toward their home. At some point, his hand curled into a fist and he knocked. A knock can mean anything. A delivery. A neighbor dropping by. A simple request. But sometimes, it's a warning. And when Hanaan Shahin opened that door, she had no idea that the next few seconds would change everything. The moment she unlocked that door, her nightmare began. There are different kinds of knocks. Some are friendly, a neighbor stopping by, a package at the door. Some are impatient, the kind that makes you roll your eyes and mutter, "I'm coming, I'm coming." And then, there's this kind. The kind that feels heavier than it should. The kind that carries something dark behind it. On the morning of October 14, 2023, in a quiet Illinois home, Hanaan Shahin heard that knock. And in the seconds before she reached for the door, she had no idea that she was about to open it to death itself. When Hanaan opened the door, she expected to see the man she had known for 2 years. Joseph Czuba. Her landlord. A man who had never been particularly warm, but never outright cruel either. A man who, just a few weeks ago, was someone she could exchange polite words with in passing. Someone who seemed normal. But today something was different. His face was tight. Eyes dark. His hands weren't empty. He had a knife. The first strike. She barely had time to react. Czuba lunged. There was no hesitation. No words, not at first. His hands closed around her throat, tight, crushing, forcing her backward. Panic surged. She fought, clawed at his arms, gasped for air. But Czuba was strong. Stronger than a 71-year-old man should have been. Fueled by something deeper than just rage. Fueled by something blind. And then, the knife. The first stab was fast. Cold. A sharp explosion of pain in her stomach. Then the second. The third. She tried to scream, but the air wouldn't come. She tried to push him off, but he didn't stop. And then he spoke. "You Muslims must die." Words drenched in hate. Words that turned a brutal attack into something worse. Something deeper. Something monstrous. Hanaan had escaped war before. She had seen violence, known fear, lived through nightmares. But this was something else. This was her home. And the monster wasn't some distant threat. It was the man who had once given her the keys to this place. The man she had trusted. Somewhere in the chaos she broke free. Stumbling, bleeding, she ran. The bathroom, she had to get to the bathroom. Slamming the door shut behind her, she fumbled with the lock, hands slick with blood. And then, for the first time, she had a second to think. Where was Wadea? She hadn't seen him. Hadn't heard him. Oh God, where was Wadea? And then she heard it. A sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Mama? There was no time to think. No time to react. The door burst open. Czuba was there, looming, the knife still dripping. And behind him, Wadea. A 6-year-old boy. Innocent. Defenseless. He was holding his hands up, like he thought that might stop the man in front of him. But there was no stopping him now. The first stab sent Wadea sprawling to the floor. The second made him cry out. The third? He stopped making a sound. 26 times. That's how many times Joseph Czuba drove that knife into a child's body. 26 times. By the time it was over, Wadea wasn't moving. The little boy who loved playing soccer, who laughed easily, who had his whole life ahead of him, was gone. 911, what's your emergency? Hanaan's voice was unrecognizable. Broken. Gasping. But the words were clear. He stabbed my son. Please hurry. When officers arrived at the scene, they weren't prepared for what they found. The front door was ajar. Blood smeared the walls, the floors. A trail leading from the living room to the hallway. A mother, barely standing, barely breathing, clinging to consciousness. And in the middle of it all, Wadea. A child. Motionless. Small. His body punctured with deep wounds. The last remnants of his life pooling beneath him. And outside? Standing calmly like none of it mattered? Joseph Czuba. He had a cut on his forehead. Self-inflicted. He stood there waiting. Silent. And when officers approached him, asked him what happened, he said nothing. Because in his mind, he had already said everything that mattered. Wadea was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The 6-year-old boy who had just celebrated his birthday was gone. His mother, Hanaan, barely survived. But the wounds he left weren't just physical. They were permanent. A scar that would never heal. A child is gone. A mother will never be the same. A community is left asking, why? Hate didn't knock on that door that morning. It kicked it down. It stole something that can never be replaced. And now, there's only one question left. What happens next? Hospitals are strange places. They hold miracles, and they hold final goodbyes. On October 14, 2023, one Illinois hospital saw both. Paramedics rushed Wadea Al-Fayoume into the emergency room. 6 years old. Unresponsive. 26 stab wounds. Doctors fought. Nurses moved fast. Machines beeped. Hands pressed. Voices shouted. But some battles are lost before they even begin. There was nothing left to save. Somewhere in the same hospital in another room, Hanaan Shahin lay bleeding. Barely conscious. Unaware that her son was already gone. And when she woke up, the first thing she asked wasn't about herself. It was about him. Where is Wadea? No one wanted to answer. Because how do you tell a mother that she survived but her child didn't? The hardest part of surviving isn't the physical pain. It's the silence. The silence in the house where a child's laughter used to be. The silence where a small voice should be asking for breakfast, for bedtime stories, for hugs. The silence in your own mind when you try to think of the last words they ever said to you. Hanaan Shahin had survived. But survival wasn't a victory. It was a punishment. In the days that followed, she barely spoke. She didn't have to. Her face said it all. Meanwhile, Joseph Czuba sat in a holding cell. No remorse. No regret. Not a word. Interrogators asked questions. He refused to answer. He just sat there, staring at the walls as if the blood on his hands wasn't even his concern. But there was one thing investigators knew for sure. This wasn't random. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a choice. A calculated act of hate. And that meant one thing: he was going to face justice. The news spread like wildfire. A 6-year-old. Murdered. Because of his religion. In the heart of Illinois, people gathered. Candles were lit. Voices rose. Justice for Wadea. Protests. Rallies. Grief turned to anger. Anger turned to action. This wasn't just one family's loss. This was a wound in the soul of a community. And they weren't going to let it be ignored. The world was watching now. Say his name. Wadea Al-Fayoume. 6 years old. A boy who loved soccer. A boy who smiled easily. A boy who never hurt anyone. Say his name because he can't say it anymore. Because hate stole it from him. But hate won't get the last word. Justice will. Trials are a lot like theater. There's an audience. There's a script. There are performers, lawyers, witnesses, defendants, all playing their roles. But unlike theater, this performance isn't about entertainment. It's about justice. Or at least, the version of justice the system can offer. And on this stage, in this cold Illinois courtroom, one man sat at the center of it all: Joseph Czuba. A landlord. A murderer. A man who had turned a home into a crime scene. And now, the world was waiting to see what would happen next. Inside the courtroom. The trial of Joseph Czuba was never going to be a quiet one. The media filled the back rows. The cameras rolled. The weight of the crime pressed against the walls. And then there she was, Hanaan Shahin. A mother who had lost everything. The only living witness to what had happened inside that house. She took the stand. And when she spoke, the room held its breath. She told them about the morning of October 14th. About the knock on the door. About the look in Czuba's eyes before he attacked. About the words he spat: "You Muslims must die." She told them how she fought. How she tried to protect her son. How she ran for help, not knowing she was already too late. Her voice never wavered. Not once. But her words were enough to break even the hardest hearts in that room. Some jurors looked down. A few wiped their eyes. Even the judge seemed to sit a little heavier in his chair. And in the defendant's seat, Joseph Czuba sat there. Expressionless. Blank. As if he was somewhere else entirely. Czuba's lawyers had a job to do. And they did their best. They tried to argue that he wasn't in his right mind. That he had been radicalized by fear. That the media had poisoned his thoughts. That he truly believed he was in danger. They tried to paint him as a man lost in paranoia, not a man driven by hate. But then the prosecution stood up. And they had just one question. If this wasn't about hate, then why did he say those words before he stabbed a 6-year-old child? Silence. Because the truth was undeniable. He knew what he was doing. He had made a choice. And now the jury had a choice to make too. Some trials stretch on for weeks, months, years. This one didn't. It took the jury less than 90 minutes. Somewhere, Czuba's lawyers were probably hoping for a miracle. Instead, they got a reality check. The verdict came swift, clear, unshakable. Guilty on all counts. Murder, attempted murder, aggravated battery, hate crime. Joseph Czuba would never walk free again. And as the judge read the verdict, the courtroom was silent. No cheers. No outbursts. Just the heavy weight of justice finally settling in. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed. The world wanted reactions. Wadea's father, Wadea Al-Fayoume, stepped forward. His voice was steady, but his eyes told a different story. "I don't know if I should be pleased or upset," he said. "I feel like this decision came a little too late." Because no verdict, no number of guilty charges, could bring his son back. The Muslim community responded too. There was relief, but also frustration. "This wasn't just about one man," one protester said. "This is about an entire system that allows hate to fester until it turns into murder." Legal experts weighed in, calling the case a landmark moment in hate crime prosecution. But the truth was simple. For Wadea Al-Fayoume, justice had come too late. And for his mother, his father, and the people who loved him, the pain wasn't going anywhere. Joseph Czuba's fate was sealed. But the real question wasn't about him anymore. It was about what came next. Would this be just another headline forgotten in a few months? Or would people remember? Would they say Wadea's name? Would they fight to make sure no other child suffered the same fate? Because if hate could kill a 6-year-old boy, then silence could do worse. And that's the real crime. It's a word that carries weight. A word that's supposed to mean something. But here's the question. Did justice truly prevail? Did a guilty verdict bring Wadea Al-Fayoume back? Did it erase the horror of October 14, 2023? Did it heal the wounds, physical and emotional, left on his mother, his family, and his community? Or was this just another moment where the justice system played catch-up, after the damage was already done? Because here's the thing, what happened to Wadea wasn't an isolated event. In this case, this trial, it was never just about one man, one crime, or one verdict. It was about something much, much bigger. Hate crime laws in the U.S. exist for a reason. They're supposed to protect people from being targeted because of their race, religion, or background. But how often do they actually work? How often does the system move fast enough, decisively enough, to stop violence before it happens? This case was different. It made headlines. It forced conversations. It put a face, Wadea's face, on the consequences of unchecked hatred. Prosecutors didn't hold back. They made it clear, this wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a targeted attack. A premeditated hate crime. And the law had to treat it as such. The conviction sent a message. But the real question? Did anyone actually hear it? Because Wadea wasn't the first victim. And he won't be the last. The numbers speak for themselves. Hate crimes against Muslims in the U.S. have been climbing. So have attacks on Jewish, Black, and immigrant communities. People are being targeted not because of what they've done, but because of who they are. And here's the ugly truth, hate doesn't come out of nowhere. It grows. It festers. It's fed by rhetoric, by misinformation, by fear. Joseph Czuba didn't wake up one morning and decide to kill a child. He had been building up to it, absorbing the paranoia, letting it shape his reality, until one day he snapped. And Wadea paid the price. So, what happens now? Do we just move on? Treat this as another tragic story, shake our heads and wait for the next one? Or do we actually do something about it? For Hanaan Shahin, life will never go back to normal. Her son is gone. Her home is a crime scene. Her body bears the scars of an attack she barely survived. But what about her spirit? Where does she go from here? How do you move forward after living through something like this? Some survivors become activists. Others retreat into the shadows, too broken to fight anymore. So far, Shahin has spoken little to the press. But her silence speaks volumes. Her grief is immeasurable. Her pain, unimaginable. She fled violence in her homeland, only to find it waiting for her in America. What does that say about the world we live in? Legal analysts call this case a landmark moment for hate crime prosecutions. But activists see it differently. Justice shouldn't be about punishment after the fact, one civil rights leader said. It should be about prevention. We failed Wadea the moment we let hate go unchecked. Some politicians made statements. condemnations, promises to do better. But words don't bring back the dead. And as the cameras turn away, as the news cycle moves on, one chilling thought remains. What happens when the next Joseph Czuba comes along? In the end, this case will be remembered for a 6-year-old boy who never got to grow up, a mother who lost everything, and a country that had to ask itself, again, how did we get here? Because if hate could do this to Wadea, then what's stopping it from reaching someone else? This story, it's not just about one tragedy. It's not just about one family, one crime, or one guilty verdict. It's about a world where hate fuels violence, where fear can turn a neighbor into a monster, where a child who should still be alive today, is not. Wadea Al-Fayoume was 6 years old. 6 years old. He liked soccer. He loved playing with his friends. He smiled wide, dreamed big. He had his whole life ahead of him. And yet, in a world filled with endless possibilities, his story was cut short by 26 stab wounds. One moment he was a boy. The next, a name in a headline. A statistic in the rising tide of hate crimes. A memory that his family will never stop holding on to. The hardest part of this story? It's not the crime itself. It's knowing that, right now, somewhere out there, another Wadea is living in fear. Another family wonders if their neighbor sees them as human. Another person, just because of their religion, their race, their background, has a target on their back. This is not just a story from the past. This is happening. Right now. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Maybe you've never been a victim of hate. Maybe you've never had to worry about whether someone sees you as the other. Maybe this story feels distant, like something tragic but far removed from your reality. But let me ask you this, what if it wasn't? What if this was your child? Your family? Your name in the headlines? Would that change the way you see the world? We tell these stories not to scare you but to remind you. To remind you that silence is dangerous. That looking away is not an option. That every single time we let hate go unchecked, we risk another Wadea. So, if this story moved you, if Wadea's life mattered to you, don't just click away and forget. Do something. Let's start by talking about it. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. How do we stop this from happening again? Like this video. Share it. Because awareness is the first step to change. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because we're not done telling the stories that need to be heard. And we're not done fighting for a world where hate has no home. Wadea Al-Fayoume should still be here. Let's make sure the next child doesn't become a headline.